All right, chapter 6, this is cognition and language. We are moving out of the biological. So in the textbook, we talk about biological, we talk about cognitive, and we talk about social emotional. There's 3 different components. We're done with biological now, and so we're going to move into cognitive, and then after we get done with that, then we'll move into the social emotional. For a lot of us, the cognitive and the social emotional seems more like psychology maybe than the biological. However, you have to have some of those biological components before you can have the cognitive and before you can have the social emotional. You have to have the physicality to go out and explore your environment before you can move through some of the stages that we're going to talk about that Piaget discovered. So, looking at that, we got the learning goals for this chapter, the key processes and the 4 stages in Piaget's theory, applying Piaget's theory in education to evaluate his theory. And then we're also going to talk about Vygotsky. He talked about some very similar things to Piaget, but he had a slightly different spin on it. So we'll get into that now. Figure 1 does show you all 4 of Piaget's stages. If you would like to look through those, we'll go through each one of those now. With Piaget's theory of development, he stressed that children actively construct their own cognitive worlds. He had different phrases for some of these ideas. One component of this, children build mental structures to help them to adapt. Piaget sought to discover how children at different points in development, how they think, and how systematic changes in children's thinking occurs. And so one of the components of this, they're called schemes. And schemes are they're actions or mental representations that help the kid begin to organize knowledge into different classifications. Baby schemes, obviously, are going to be structured by pretty simple actions. And then older children's schemes include strategies and plans for problem solving. There are 2 different kinds. There's behavioral schemes. So these are going to be physical activities like kicking a ball. There's different things that go into that. And then mental schemes or cognitive activities. You'll have like a set pattern on how to think about that mental scheme. Here's an example of a behavioral scheme. Grabbing a bottle. There's lots of things going on there. You have to think. Again, you have that sensory input where you see the bottle. You're like, okay, I see the bottle. Now I want to grab the bottle, so I have to think about moving my hand to grab the bottle, and then you have to actually grip it, and then you have to bring it back to you. There's a lot of things going on. Seems very simple to us because we do it all the time. But for a baby, there's a lot of things that are going on there. That is a behavioral scheme. As an example of a mental scheme, so let's say you see a vehicle. It has wheels. It moves along the road. You call this a car. So now you have a scheme for cars. It's a vehicle, has wheels, moves down the road. You have a scheme for car. Combining this with the next part, assimilation. Assimilation is where you use an existing scheme to incorporate new information. So you've got the scheme for a car, and then one day you see a pickup or you see a motorcycle, and it's a vehicle. It's moving down the road, and it has wheels. So to a toddler, small kid, baby, these are all going to be cars. The only scheme that you have at this point is a car. So you see a motorcycle, it's car. You see a pickup, it's car. You are trying to assimilate these new vehicles into the existing scheme that you have. Another example of this, calling all men daddy. So this is another example of assimilation. You're basically trying to force all men that you see into the category scheme in your head. There was a kid at daycare just recently. I was picking up Leif, and a kid calls me Dada. I've never seen this kid before, and he's calling me Dada. It's because he has this scheme that men, older adult men, are Dadas. When Leif was younger, he would sometimes reach toward me to get me to pick him up, and he'd go, Maman, Maman. So he was calling me French. It's the French word for mom. And in his head, Maman, that's the person that takes care of him, and it's not necessarily gender-based. So there for a while, I was Maman. Now, I'm not Maman anymore, but when he was younger, he had that scheme for caregiver, and it was Maman. You go through this assimilation where you try to fit things into your existing schemes, and then you move into accommodation. At a certain point, you realize that a motorcycle is not the same as a car. It has 2 wheels. It's not enclosed like a car is. So you make an accommodation, and now you create a new scheme separate from cars for motorcycles. So that's how kids start to organize their schemes and how they begin to think about the world and how they divide things up. And so this organization of this, where you're grouping isolated behaviors or thoughts into higher ordered, smoothing, functioning cognitive systems, like the idea for vehicles, there's a continual refinement for that, and it is an inherent part of development. This is another example. You might have a vague idea of how to use a hammer, and so now you might have a vague idea of how to use other tools, because you kind of organize them all together into this idea of tools. You use these with your hands to do something. Equilibration. What Piaget thought with this is when a kid moves from one stage to the other. So in that in-between time, they'll be in a conflict or disequilibrium, where things just don't quite make sense, when they're trying to figure out what to do with that motorcycle because it doesn't quite fit with the cars. When they're in that conflict stage, that's what this is. And then when they get on the other side, and then they have the schemes that actually do make sense in the way that we perceive them as adults. They eventually resolve that conflict and reach a balance or equilibrium of thought. It's also a new way of thinking. So as they go through these stages, and we'll discuss all this, it's a new way for them to try to understand the world. Their cognition can change just like that, a snap of fingers. As an example, with Leif, he has different little puzzles, like maybe animal puzzles, and it's like a sheep will go here and a cow will go here. So it's just like one-piece puzzles that kind of go in different places. He couldn't really do more complex puzzles, like 4-piece puzzles. He just couldn't quite figure it out. And then just one day he wakes up and he can do a 12-piece puzzle. So he went from not being able to put hardly any puzzle pieces together, being able to do a 12-piece. The next night he could do almost a 31-piece puzzle all by himself. And it's actually pretty amazing that these shifts can occur just so quickly like that. And it's great, and that is what you want as a parent. But just kind of as a side note, why this stuff is happening, you as a parent, you're gaining a lot, but you're also losing a little bit. So that Leif that was kind of cute, that couldn't put the puzzle pieces together, that Leif is gone. And I am not going to be able to interact with that Leif ever again. So at each one of these stages, you are essentially getting almost a new kid, a kid that thinks completely different about the world. But that old kid that you loved, they're gone. And so it's one of the reasons why you definitely want to spend as much time with your kid as you can, because poof, overnight, they're different and they're just not quite the same kid anymore. And you're not going to have the chance to interact with that kid ever again, that exact kid ever again. All right, so that's the first part of Piaget. In the next part, we will get into the first actual stage, which is the sensory motor stage.